All right, so here we go. Megadeth album tier. Let's start with Rest in Peace. This one is obviously S+. If you had an S+ rating, like one of the best albums ever recorded is Rest in Peace. If you don't believe me, just go listen to it. Now I'm going to make a little statement here. The original recording is much better than the remaster. For whatever reason, Dave and company started putting out remasters of older albums, starting with Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good. And that one needed a remaster, but Rest in Peace really did not, and the remaster, I think, is much worse than the original version. It's not bad, but it does not have the edge that the original version had. The original version just sounds better top to bottom. It's not as volume maximized, but who cares? I don't really care about that. I think the production sounds amazing. I think it was recorded in 1991 or 1990. So it has great production in general. Every song on the album is good, even like even like Dawn Patrol, which is like a little filler track, has like a cool mood to it. Some of the best guitar solos ever recorded. It's just going to be one of the best albums you've ever heard. Sorry, I got some allergies today. All right, let's move on. Okay, Euthanasia. I'm going to put this one as an A. So Euthanasia was one of my favorite albums growing up. Now, are all the songs as good as Rest in Peace? Definitely not. But there's a ton of good songs on here. Great production. I think Dave Mustaine's vocals sound really good. Some of the best guitar tone that they've recorded is actually on Euthanasia. So I think it's got actually an A tier album. I think it's an A tier album. Next is Cryptic Writings. Now, Cryptic Writings to me was good when it came out, but on further listens, it's a C. Half the songs are really good. Half the songs are decent or okay. And then you have a couple mediocre tracks. There's an edge missing from this album. And compared to Metallica at the time, which is doing the load reload stuff, yeah, it's more metal. But it felt like a big step back. And the same producer for Cryptic Writings also did Risk, which we'll get to. And so Cryptic Writings ended up, to me, being a little bit overrated. And I have this gray version. I have the silver version of the album, which was like a limited edition. I bought it when it came out. It has some cool songs like Use the Man and stuff, but in general, it's one of those average albums. Megadeth has done some average albums, and so this is kind of where that one is. Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good. I'm actually going to put this one up at a B. Now, there's really good songs on here. There's mechanics. There's a whole bunch of good stuff. It is a very historic album, but it suffers from a bunch of things that stop it from being a really great listen, 30, 40 years later. And 40 years later, whoa, we're approaching 40 years. That's crazy to think about. Anyway, so Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good. It's a good album to listen to. It's kind of like De Mysteriis Domus Athanis, in that it's a very historic album. It influenced lots of people, but it's not that great to listen to just on its own. The remaster is very much better than the original version. Everything's a lot clearer, louder. It just sounds much better. I had the original version like back in high school, and the remaster sounds just better top to bottom. Although I kind of like the original cover art, which is just a picture of like the Vic skull. But anyway, it still is not very well produced. The performances are off. There's timing issues with the band because they recorded it quickly and on a budget, I assume. Dave Mustaine, it's probably his worst vocal performance. He hadn't really figured it all out yet, but there's a raw energy in there that's really exciting. Kind of like Kill 'Em All by Metallica. The energy of it kind of makes up for otherwise its shortcomings. Now, this one may divide some fans, but I'm putting this one actually up at an A, which is so far so good, so what. This was one, basically, you had Gar Samuelson and Chris Poland got kicked out of the band. Either left or got kicked out. I think Gar got kicked out because he was addicted to heroin and was like selling pieces of his drum set. and he just couldn't operate in the band, so Dave fired him. And Chris Poland, I think, also got fired. I don't remember if he got fired or like they had an argument and he left. And so he was replaced by Chris. Oh man, what's his last name? He was replaced by the guitar tech, like while they were on tour. And so they finished that off. And Chuck Beeler. Chuck Beeler is who replaced him. And so, but he sounds good. He sounds really good on the album. The lead guitar sounds really good. This has a return. This has like a really raw 80s energy to it. And the question is whether this is like whether this is the best album of the 80s or if it's, Peace Sells. But it's actually a really good album. And it's an album that just bangs on top to bottom. Like you can begin the album and end the album. Every song just is an attack. You start with an instrumental track called Set the World on Fire that's just like vicious guitar soloing, and it just has a great feel to it. It feels very late 80s thrashed in a way that a lot of albums are missing. While other bands were trying to refine, like Metallica produced And Justice for All, which is a very refined album. This one is a very energetic and intense album, and I like it for that reason. So now, Countdown to Extinction. This one is, for my personal taste, I'm going to put it here. It's still an A. Maybe it's here. Almost a B. No, it's an A. The reason it's not S, some people put it S. It has some of their best songs on it. It has some great radio tracks. But they're just not as good as So Far So Good So What. On a track-by-track basis, they're not nearly as good as Rest in Peace. It's a step back from Rest in Peace. It's a more pop-oriented sound. There are some good songs in there, and then there's some that are just forgettable, kind of like Black Album. There's just a couple of tracks on there that you're like, or you listen to the album again, you're like, oh yeah, I remember this song, but you just didn't pay that much attention to it. But I will say that Marty Friedman's solo work on this album is fantastic. Obviously, Marty Friedman is like a perfect addition to the band for Rest in Peace. That's the first album he performed on. But Countdown to Extinction was just flat out one of the best guitar-oriented albums that Marty Friedman was on. His solos are just fantastic. So much variety, so much to listen to just for the lead guitar. And one of the things I love about these Megadeth albums is that if you open up the little booklet, you can see the solos listed. It'll say solo Mustaine, solo Friedman, or even solo. Who am I thinking of? The other Dave in the band. So it'll tell you what solo, like bass solo, is there, like in what order. So you have an idea of what each guitar player sounds like. This was really useful to me when I was like growing up, because I would listen to it and be like, okay, that's what Dave Mustaine. And you get this kind of feel of what, like the guitar player's voice as you're going through it. Next one. Now this one was really big when it came out. This one is The World Needs a Hero. We really liked it when it came out. It had Return to Hangar 18. It was like a return to metal. I think Marty Friedman had left the band at this point. And I'm trying to remember who replaced him. It was good, though. Paul Di'Anno? Yeah, anyway, it was a good album. It had some good songs on it. But going back and listening to it today, it's almost a D. Like, it almost is a D. And that's because, like, there's just some really cheesy tracks. It feels very rushed. It feels very phoned in. Like, the tracks just, it doesn't feel like they were feeling it at all. It kind of felt like they were just assembling different songs based on their back catalog. They're like, oh, people like this, so let's just make another song that sounds like that. It's not a terrible album, but it's definitely low average now that I've gone back to it. Let's see here. United Abominations. This album, it's a B. It has some great songs on it, like Years of War. It's a good album, but it's one of those albums that, like, none of the songs made it onto the radio. But I still think it's a pretty good album to listen to. It has a lot of great work on it. It has great solo work on it. I think Glenn Drover is on the album, and Sean Drover, his brother. So brothers, they had a band called Eidolon. Of course, Glenn Drover played for King Diamond. And some other bands too. Glenn Drover's a very talented guitarist. Sean Drover's a very talented drummer. I think it really helped the band with the sound. So it's a great sound, but none of those like standout radio play tracks like you had on these earlier albums. And by this time, the entire radio complex was just ignoring Megadeth, but they're still selling gold albums easily because they have a great fan base. And it's a good album. It feels like a band again. When we get to, what is it? The System Has Failed. I'll talk about that one a little bit. Now, Super Collider, this is one of the ones that I'm like, I really want to put it at an F. I think it's their worst album by far. By far. It's their worst album. And it might be a D. It might be a D. But I feel like it's an F. Trying to go back and listen to it not that long ago. There's no good songs on it. There's not a single good song. So that to me says it's got to be like F. It's got to be bottom tier. There are individual good moments. There's individual good riffs. The performances aren't bad. They're not bad performances. After this, you had Sean Drover leave and you had Chris Broderick leave the band. It felt very phoned in. It felt like something they recorded just to have an album that they could put out. It's really bad. It's the main thing I could say. It's not like it's weird because it's like Saint Anger is worse because you start comparing to other bands. Like other bands have done worse albums than Super Collider. Super Collider's big offense is that it's simply very, very boring. Nothing on it sounds interesting. It sounds like a bunch of gray goop. But it's not like entirely offensive. There's not like a bad production vibe to it or something like that. It's just a bunch of bad songs. Like the songs aren't good. So I'm going to put it as their F tier album. 13, this is a D album to me. 13 was a big disappointment, and what it sounded like, and I gather this is what it is. It was a bunch of old riffs that basically Dave Mustaine assembled into songs and made an album out of. Like he just like assembled it on Pro Tools or Cubase or whatever he uses. And one of the things that you pick up from that, you look at the album credits, and Marty Friedman is listed as a co-writer in a bunch of songs. You're like, did they hang out and like did he write more songs with the band? And the answer was no. Dave Mustaine was just using old unused riffs from when he was in the band. So that kind of lets you know what the album's about, and that it really is just a bunch of stuff that wasn't good enough for other albums, and it sounds like that. It's again, the big offense for 13 is that it's just very boring. There's just not a lot of interest to it. Even the solos sound off, as they sound off in like Super Collider. They're just not very good. And it's disappointing considering what came right before it, which was Endgame. Endgame is a very good album. So 13 was just a disappointment. You could say it's a low C. It kind of feels kind of average. So I'm actually going to, I don't know if I want to put it at a D or like a low C. I'm going to put it at a low C for now because it's just not very good. It's not a terrible album. It's not like terribly executed. It's just very boring. But these are definitely a tier above. It's going into D. All right, Endgame. I'm sorry, no. The System Has Failed. This is another B album. System Has Failed is actually a really good album. I really enjoyed it when it came out. I gave it a listen not that long ago, and it really holds up. It's basically a Dave Mustaine album, though. It's not. It's a Megadeth album because it's Dave Mustaine, but it's Dave Mustaine. I think who's playing on it? Is it Vinny Colaiuta? I think Vinny Colaiuta's playing drums. So he has like a bunch of studio cats in just like playing bang good metal on here. In fact, I think it's better than United Abominations. They're playing really good. So the musicianship is absolutely top tier. You have Chris Poland come in to do solos. People were really hoping he would rejoin the band. He didn't rejoin the band. But it's a really very well executed album. You have some great standout tracks like Kick the Chair. It just kicks your butt from top to bottom. It's one of those albums that you put in and it's kind of like a Carcass album. It just starts up and just goes and goes until it ends. It's a really good album in that case. I mean, I'm tempted to even put it into A tier, even though I feel like it's a strong B though. Like these are almost A tier, but they're just kind of held back. And I think the only thing that holds it back is just there's a couple tracks that aren't that memorable. That's all. I feel like to be an A album, you got to have every track be good, and to be S, it's like every track has to not just be good, but the album as a whole has to be better than anything else. All right, In Game. This is to me is actually an S tier album. This was Chris Broderick joined the band. You had who was playing bass? The guy from White Lion. Who am I thinking of? Before David rejoined the band. His name's slipping my mind. But anyway, In Game. Maybe it's high A. We'll put it high A. It's really good. I think it's one of their best albums. Every track is really good. The solos are great. Every track is worth listening to. We were wanting to learn the guitar parts from it. Chris Broderick sounded amazing. It definitely was a showcase of like some great talent in the band. It was a really good lineup. So I don't know. It's either probably we'll put it at high A. Dystopia. Dystopia is A. This one has Kiko on it, Kiko Loureiro, and he sounds amazing. I think kind of like Marty Friedman, he has such a different style from Dave Mustaine, it really complements it. Whereas Chris Broderick's kind of a chameleon. He kind of can just sound like other players, and that's really cool. But he doesn't have his own voice the way Kiko does. And so having Kiko in the band, I think, really elevated the sound. You also have, I'm trying to remember who played drums on this album. I think it was the drummer from Lamb of God. Anyway, he does a great job on the album, and in general, it's an excellent album. Pretty much every track is good. I've enjoyed listening to it front to back a bunch of times. So yeah, I really enjoyed this album. I don't know. I think it's maybe here though for me. Maybe actually here. It's really good though. It's definitely A. It's definitely like an A tier album. You know. Let's see here. Risk. Risk is very underrated. I'm going to say Risk is actually better than The World Needs a Hero. Risk is one of the most underrated albums of all time. It's maybe even a B, but I'm going to put it at C. I like it better than Cryptic Writings. It's not really a metal album. It's kind of like Load and Reload. It's much more rock oriented. Supposedly this is more of the stuff that Marty Friedman really wanted to do creatively was the stuff from Risk. And they took a risk. It's called Risk because they took a risk doing new stuff. There's actually a lot of good tracks, and the best tracks are actually like the non-metal tracks. There's two versions of the album you can listen to. There's the original version where the producer added a bunch of stuff, and then there's like a remix or remaster that Dave Mustaine did that took out all the stuff that the producer added on. I think it's really interesting to listen to both of them. I'm not sure which one's better. I actually would probably say that the remaster remix, the version Dave Mustaine came out with later on, is the better version of the album. I think the tracks just sound much better and cleaner without all the synthesizer and the extra instruments and crap that the producer threw on here. Same producer for these two albums. I don't think he fit Megadeth sound well, but it's actually a very underrated album. If you go back and listen to it, there's a lot of good stuff. Kind of like Load and Reload, there's actually a lot of good material on there, including tracks that people hated like Breadline, which are actually really good rock tracks. They're just not. They don't sound like Megadeth, and that's I think the problem that fans had with it. And it's not invalid. Like if you picked up a Motorhead album and it was like soft rock, you'd be a little bit upset. But just objectively speaking, I think it's actually a good album. So far, so good. So what? Peace sells, but who's buying? S tier album. We'll just put it there. It's not as good as Rust in Peace, but it's very good. This was actually the first Megadeth album I bought, and I bought it mostly because I was like, I want to get a Megadeth album. I don't know which one to get. This cover looks cool, and this album was like blew my mind. Now there's a remix edition. I think the remix edition or the remaster edition actually sounds really good, but I have an attachment to the original production, probably just an emotional attachment. I think the remastered production is better. it's just a clear album. It's louder, it's more intense, it has a better modern feeling to it. So you could listen to both and compare them, but I think the remaster is probably the better one to go with there. But I am attached to the original production quite a bit. It had that scooped mid sound from the 80s. So did Rest in Peace. I just love that guitar sound. The bass sounds great on this album. It's just a really good album in general. Every single song is good. Dave Mustaine's vocal performance is actually really good on it. It's better than it is, and so far so good, so what, but it still has this intense edge. If you like the vocal performances of the more radio friendly, Countdown to Extinction, you're probably going to like Peace Sells, but Who's Buying? So yeah, David Ellefson on here sounds really, really good. I think it's one of his best performances, actually. There's a lot of great bass work on this album that I just really enjoyed. So anyway, there's your Megadeth tier list. Now, if we were going to compare this to the Metallica one, you'd see Metallica has another S tier album. Megadeth has way more A tier. Like their consistency is way higher. They really only have one album that I would consider just like no good songs on it. That was Super Collider. But all their other albums, there's generally, even Risk, their bad album from the 90s, is actually pretty decent if you give it a shot. Same thing with Load and Reload from Metallica. They're actually pretty decent albums. So anyway, there's your Megadeth spread. I really, in general, like this stuff. I had another one I pulled up here that was like the Megadeth, members. Maybe we'll do that another time, like the members of Megadeth. Here's Gar Samuelson. He's like amazing on Peace Sells, but then he's on heroin, so I don't know where to put him. Anyway, so that's that. The objective tier list for Megadeth. Leave me your thoughts. I don't know if you guys have any different thoughts about the Megadeth tier list. Anyway, so that's that. Let's go ahead and move on.